Hi everyone, Neil here from Diagonal Move. Welcome to the channel. What I'm going to do today is take a look at the rules and how to play Imperium Classics. This is a game that is a relatively recent addition to my collection, just the last month, 6 weeks or so, and it's already moving well up the ranks of go-to games for me to play when I want an interesting, challenging game to play in the evening that I can finish in an evening and that I can play solo. So this is a rapidly rising game in my personal opinion, but it is also a game that has a fair amount of terminology, rules, and a learning curve. So when I go through the rules for this game, I'm going to do it relatively slowly and break down certain things and focus on the things that I personally struggled with. There does appear to be a bit of a glare. Unfortunately, it's I can't really do much about that. The glare is coming through the window, but apologies for that. Hopefully it won't be too much of an issue. So in the game, it's a deck building game. There's a ton of cards. You have a range of cards that act as the common pool, like you would do in most deck building games, and then you also have your own unique deck of cards. And your unique deck of cards represents one of 8 factions in the box that I have. I have what's called the Imperium Classics box. If you have the Imperium Legends box, which is the companion set to this, the rules are exactly the same, but you have a different set of 8 factions. The game is asymmetric, and each of the factions will follow the main rules to one extent or another, but they will break them in their own unique way as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm not going to go through every single rule for every single faction or the minutiae of all the different effects and so on. This is just intended to give you the basics and how things work for the basic gameplay. Okay, and as I mentioned before, one of the things that I personally struggled with was the volume of iconography and terminology in the game. So what I'm going to do, starting with your own player deck, and this is the Persians. Each faction is based on a historical civilization, and here we just have Persia. This isn't a strategy guide, so I won't go into the difference as to why this deck would be leaning towards one way or another compared to other factions, but it will be unique in its own way compared to the others, and each of the other factions in the set and in the Imperium set, the Imperium Legends set, is also unique. Anyway, I'm rambling on a little bit about that, but just to say, this is not a full breakdown of the rules for every single faction in the game. It's just the main gameplay. So let's start with the cards now. This is your deck of cards. Each faction will have a deck of cards somewhere between 20-25 cards in size. That's your starting deck. The cards themselves are of different types, and there are 5 different types for the Persians. Some factions have 6, some factions have less. It depends on the faction, but we'll start with most factions have 5, certainly in the classic set. And you have, first up, you have worth noting that in the corner is like this little purple sign, purple flashing. That indicates that it's your deck, it's the Persians, and regular cards, or what we'll call common cards, do not have that flashing. Okay, so if a card has a little flash in the corner, it is a faction's card. Now you can, I'm mentioning that because they can get mixed up. You can have cards circulating around the game, but your nation, if you like, this is the Persians. We are the Persians, we can tell because it says the Persians on it. You have also on your home card or your nation's card a reverse side with an ability on it, and I will go more into the some of the abilities and effects as I go through the rules a bit later on. But just to say, it is double-sided. One side of your power card, as it's known, identified by that symbol there, will have no ability, and the other side will have an ability. Depending on how experienced you are with the game, depends which one you start with. In the corner here we do have the little gold coin, which indicates that the card is worth VPs at the end of the game. Okay. Next up you have what is called your Ascension card. This is the card with a little dot in the corner, and that is the card that when it comes into your hand, that is when you move from being a barbarian state, which would be signified by this card here, and I'll get to that later. But basically what would happen when that card here comes into your hand, you would flip the state card from barbarian through to an empire. Okay, and that's important for when you can use certain cards and so on. Next up in your personal deck of cards, you have what are called your nation cards. And these are identified by the crescent moon in the corner there. And again, different factions have different numbers of these. Persians have 4. Then with the little kind of star or cross symbol, plus sign, these are your development cards, and these cards are cards that come into your hand. These are your sort of boosted up cards, if you like. And as you can see, most of them have a VP thing in the corner there. And then there are your kind of regular cards, if you like, your main deck. They don't have any symbol on the flashing in the corner. On the cards, there's a whole bunch of iconography, as you've probably noticed. This symbol here, we have the squiggly line, we have a kind of a mountain. These are the suit of cards, and there's different suits in the game. I'll get more into what the suits are when we do the commons pool, but for example, you might have a fire symbol, a flag, a mountain. There's like a leaf as well, and a classical Greek column as well would be the other type. That's the suit. Okay, doesn't really affect gameplay per se, but it just identifies what group of cards it belongs to. Something that does affect gameplay is this flashing in the corner of the cards here. That is whether you are applicable for when you're an empire or if you're a barbarian. You can only play cards with these symbols in the relevant phase of the game. So the battering ram here couldn't be played when you were a barbarian, and the conquer card can't be played when you are an empire. You will have some text, and there's a ton of text on many of the cards. And you will have possibly some symbols like this. You got a little bag and a water droplet, or you may have a house or something similar. They have no effect on gameplay, but cards in the text will reference those symbols. For example, the battering ram here says each other player abandons a house, and then you can do something else. And so these symbols are referenced by other cards, but again, they don't really affect gameplay in and of themselves. Something that does influence gameplay is this little infinity symbol. That represents cards that are permanent. When you play them, you place them in your player area. Okay, I'll go into more about how some of this stuff works a bit later, but that's a permanent card. Normally they are discarded at the end of your turn, the cards that you've played. We have a little sword. These are basically attack cards. The specific name escapes me at the moment, but they are basically attack cards. They affect other players. What else do we have? That's quite a lot to take in straight away, I'm sure. Oh yeah, we do have a special suit called Unrest. These are the cards that effectively chunk up your hand. You'll see in the text there, hopefully you got a little pile of bricks and a little like chess pawn symbol. They represent the currencies in the game. The bricks are materials, and the pawns there are the population, and they will cost. That's the currency you will pay to, for example, build a card when you develop, and I'll get more into what that means later. What else might you see? I think that's more or less it. There's obviously effects and so on the cards, but I think that is the bulk of what you have in your hand at the start of the game and what the cards do and what some of the symbols represent. Because this is so asymmetric, some cards have different symbols or different terminology depending on the faction. But hopefully that's given you a sense of what's in your deck. What I'll do next is I'll move on to setup, and that'll be in two parts. There'll be the player setup and then the commons deck setup. Player setup. First thing you'll do is you will place your power card or your country card in front of you. Leave a little bit of space underneath so you can play some of those permanent cards later, but start with place your card for your nation in front of you. Remember, it's double-sided depending on how experienced you are. Generally speaking, if you're new to the game, you'll need to start with the B side without a special ability. Next to that, place your Ascension card. This is the one with the little dot, and you kind of need to place it above, like so. Okay. On top of that, you have your development cards. Give them a shuffle and then place them face down on top of your Ascension card. Some of the factions have a varying setup, but this is the way it works for the majority of cases. To the left of your Ascension card and what is known as the Nation deck, you will place your development cards, and these are the ones with the star in the corner. Give them a shuffle, place them face up next to your Nation deck. That is your development area or your development deck. Take a card called a state card, Empire, Barbarian on either side. This will be placed next to your power card, and then on that place one prosperity token. That is essentially victory points, and 2 of your population, and 3 materials. Those 3 things are the currencies in the game. You'll also need to place these tokens here. You have exhaust tokens and you have action tokens. These do go on your state card as well. Now the materials and the population and the prosperity, they don't have to live on there, but for the purposes of being on the screen, I've put them on this card. But the action tokens and the exhaust tokens do need to live on your card. Everything else that you have, you will shuffle into a pile, place it face down. That is your draw deck, and then your starting hand is usually 5 cards. Now, some of the factions will have cards that are applicable for a certain player count, and you'll need to take those out if you're playing with less than the specified number. And you'll also potentially need to do certain other things if you're some of the factions, so bear that in mind. So we have, just to recap, the power area, the power card. We have the Nation deck with the Ascension card underneath, the development area, the state card, your draw deck, and then cards in hand at the start of your turn. That is how you set up the player deck or the player area. Each player will do this. Once you have finished everyone's finished setting up their player area, you'll take what is called the Solstice card and place it in between the first player and the last player, determined randomly. So this is the market board. It's in 3 parts. You have each of the various suits in the game displayed, and you'll need to set it so that you have the 4 symbol section on the far left and the symbol with the little door thing there, or exit sign on the right. Each of these symbols represents a suit in the game, and it's where you'll place the draw decks for the different types of cards. Depending on the player count, you will need to put a certain amount of cards above and a certain amount of cards into the general main deck area, which will be here. But let's get to that in a moment. Now, some of the card decks do have cards that are specific for use with 3 and 4 players. So if you're playing with less than those player counts, you will need to take them out. I've already done that, but they would have a little sort of 3+ or 4+ symbol in the bottom. Okay, but what you'll do, and let's just pretend for now it's a 2-player game. You'll give the deck a shuffle. This is the region deck, which is the mountain symbol, and you'll randomly put 6 above the region sign, and the rest go to one side just for now. We then have what are called the uncivilized cards, which have this kind of green leaf on them. Some of these do have a column symbol, which would be the civilized deck, which we'll get more into those in a moment. But when there's 2, they count as the leaf for setup, or both during regular gameplay. But during setup, it's the leaf. And again, we would take 6 after shuffling and place them at the appropriate spot, and the remainder go on top of the main deck. I spell on there. We then have the civilized cards, which will need to go here. Again, give them a shuffle, take out 6 in a 2-player game, and place those 6 at the top, and a main deck starting to form there. The tributary cards, I believe that's the official term for them. These are the nations that you have conquered, if you like. When you set these up, particularly if you have both boxes, you just need to make sure that the factions you're playing are not represented in this deck. If they are, you'll need to take them out. Also, if there are any 3 and 4 player specific ones, you'll need to make sure you have the right ones for the right player count. But these just sit in the main deck. Now, I put all 4 sets of cards in the main deck there, but what you'd obviously do is you'd shuffle them up to form the main deck. Now, I'm not going to spend ages doing that right now, but you would shuffle that and put them there. Here we have a suit that we've not seen before. This is slightly different to some of the others. This is your what's called the Fame deck. I think it's Fame. And there's a special card called the King of Kings. This is a card that will trigger the game end. And we'll get to that a little bit later. But basically you place the King of Kings with the A side up. Starting to come off camera, aren't I? Place the King of Kings with the A side up. And then you will shuffle and place the remainder on top, like so. The unrest cards, which are these ones with like the fire, these are the junk cards that are detrimental to have. They are shuffled and placed face up underneath. Okay. That symbol there in the corner of the screen, that means exile. That's a space that you need to have at the edge of the board where you clear out certain cards when certain card effects happen. As you can see, I'm on my slightly smaller table. So there's a space here where you will exile certain cards, and I'll get into that a bit later. To finish the setup here, what you need to do is just reveal the top card of each of the decks. Top 2 cards of the main deck. I'll just take one randomly from the middle because I haven't shuffled them, but there we go, we should have different cards. What you need to do is, if you have cards that are not the yellow mountain cards, so not the regions, they have an unrest card underneath them. So all of these cards here will need an unrest card with them. Okay. Then, if there are any cards with the symbol for the development deck, so the Greek column, you need to just pop a progress token on there or a victory point on there. Okay, that's the setup for the Commons deck. It sounds like a lot to do, all this setup, but once you're familiar with it, it's really quite quick. Okay, so all that's left to do after that is start the game. Just a quick recap, we have our power card, the state, the development area, the nation area, and our draw deck. And so how do we actually play this game? As I said, it's quite involved and there's a bit of a learning curve. But let's start with the simplest action. And there are three things you can do in the game. You can activate, innovate, or revolt. And I'm going to do these in reverse order because revolt is the simplest one. Basically, what will happen when you revolt is you can return any of these what's called unrest cards to the main unrest pile. Okay. To do that, you would return them, literally just put them in the pile, and then you would finish your turn and move on to cleanup. I'll come into what cleanup is in a minute. Okay, and this is how some of those nation specific cards, those faction specific cards, get mixed in with the common pool. Okay, so that's the first one. Discard the junk from your hand. Very simple. The second one is innovate. First, with innovate, you discard your whole hand. Okay, so you just pop your whole hand into your discard pile, and then you do what is called breakthrough. And breakthrough is a way of acquiring cards. I'll go into the specifics of how you do it a little bit later on when I look at some of the specific abilities. But to break through, you basically take a card from this row or this row. When you break through, you take one of these cards, place it in your discard pile. Okay, if you break through for a visible card, you take the card that you choose, place it in your discard, but then if there is an unrest card underneath, you put it onto the unrest pile and redraw. So breakthrough is a way of acquiring cards from either the top row or the visible row without acquiring unrest while you do it. If there are any of these tokens on the card that you take, you get to keep the tokens. Okay. The third thing that you can do, and probably the thing you'll be doing the majority of the time, is activating. And when you activate, you spend your action tokens in order to play cards. Okay. Now, what you'll do, for instance, let's say you want to play this card, play it in front of you, place one of those tokens on it, activate the effect. In this case, it's gain a couple of progress tokens, and then remove the card into what's known as history. I'll come onto that history when we do the key terms section, but basically play the card, activate its effect, either get rid of it or place it somewhere according to the information on the card, and you can do that 3 times. So we do this, activate the effect, and then we'll do that and activate the effect. Now, some things require you to have certain conditions to fulfill them. So for example, this glory card, you in order to have its effect, you must have 3 region cards in front of you that you've played. Okay. The region cards are these ones. For a card to be in front of you throughout your turn into the next turn, you need to have one of the infinity symbols, because at this point you'll remove your tokens, place this into your discards and put any permanent cards, infinity symboled cards, into your play area in front of you. You need a little bit of space. Cards that you haven't spent, you can then choose to discard or to keep. If you discard them or keep them, you still then have to draw back up to your hand limit, which for most of the time is 5, unless you have effects that change that. Then you draw back up to your hand limit. Now, drawing back up to your hand limit is worth talking about in its own right, because if you draw up to 5, all well and good. However, let's just pretend for a moment we only drew up to 4. We need to reshuffle our deck, and that has a certain way of doing it. So the first thing you do is you'll check to see if you've got one of these symbols on your nation pile. If you do, you just reshuffle this deck and place a card back into discard as normal. So if you have that symbol, you discard and redraw, you reshuffle and redraw as normal. However, if you don't have one of those symbols, so it looks like this, what you'll do is you'll add a card from the nation deck into your discard, place what's called an exhaust token on there, reshuffle, and then draw back up to your hand limit. Okay, so that's a way of getting your better cards into the deck, but of course you cannot do it while you have the exhaust token on there. Once you've done your actions, you've either revolted, innovated, or you've spent up to your action token limit for the activate element, you move into the cleanup. Now the cleanup, first thing you do is you add a point token or a progress token to one of these cards, your choice, not the unrest cards obviously, but the one of those cards. At this point in the multiplayer game, the next person can start taking their turn, because you then have to clear up. If you do have any action tokens left on any cards, you need to put them in here. You also need to remove any exhaust cards and exhaust tokens. Now, you may get in a situation where you redraw your deck in the middle of your turn, or even on someone else's turn, and the whole exhaust develop the nation area to take a card would apply out of turn order. Okay, so you do that whenever you need to redraw, but it's when you redraw, not when you run out of cards. So if your draw deck was empty but you don't need to draw cards, you don't do that until you need to take a card. And then once you have removed all the tokens, you have the right number of cards in hand, you then move on to the next, the next player carries on with their turn if they started already, or they just finished their turn. When you burn through this pile of deck, well, not burn necessarily in the deck building sense of the word, but once you've got through the pile of cards and you reach your ascension card, when this ascension card is taken, that is when you flip to the Empire side, and any cards like these ones here with the axe symbol, they can no longer be used, but cards with the Empire symbol, the crown there, can be used. When you need to redraw back up to 5 and you have an empty deck and an empty nation deck, you can then pay the cost to develop. The way development works is you can pick a card, and if you can pay for the card and the deck isn't exhausted, you can then choose one of these cards, pay the cost, pop it in your discard pile, shuffle and redraw. Difference between the nation deck, which was the ones with the crescent moons, and the development deck is the nation deck, you can't see what you're getting. Development deck, you can choose. Quite an important difference. Okay, once everybody has had their turn, you then do what's known as a solstice. it's come back to the original player, but before the first player takes their turn again, you do a solstice. And what happens is everybody who has a card with a solstice effect in their play area, for example this one here, conveniently has a solstice, it sits in your player area and you activate any cards with the solstice ability in your player area. Everybody does that. Okay. So we've covered setup, we've covered the actions that you can take. How do you win? Well, there's a few different ways to win. I say to win, there's a few different ways to end the game. The winner is the person with the most points, unless you have a collapse. What's a collapse? Let's talk about that now. Okay. If this deck here runs out, the game ends immediately, and the winner is the person with the fewest unrest cards in their hand. If scoring is triggered and then there's a collapse, collapse takes precedence over scoring. When there's a collapse, you don't do any points calculations, nothing like that. It's simply the person with the fewest unrest cards in their player area, in their deck, in their hand. One thing about this game is when you work out the scoring and the end of the game, every card in front of you counts except unpaid for development cards. So if there's anything sat in this deck at the end of the game, you don't count that towards VP. Everything else does count, and that's quite important. So the fewest cards in a collapse is the person who wins. Now, if you don't collapse, you then have what's called scoring, and scoring is what's triggered in a few different ways. First way to trigger scoring is for the main deck at the top here to be completely empty. Why is this called the main deck? Because when you run out of cards here, you just take the top one and place it in front of you. If this section here is empty, that triggers scoring. Scoring, the round ends, and then there's a final round after that. The other way to trigger scoring is for this deck, the Fame deck, to be empty and the King of Kings to have been played and flipped to its reverse side. The other way to trigger scoring is for one player's development deck to be completely in their hand or in their discards or somewhere in use. There are a couple of other ways to trigger scoring round based on certain factions, but I won't go into that at the moment. That gets quite involved. Okay. When you trigger a scoring round, as I mentioned, you finish the round you're doing and then have one more complete round. Then you need to work out your points, and you kind of need to leave the cards where they are, because some scoring effects will be based on where the cards are. Okay, it's a little bit, you kind of need a pen and paper to figure it out. But the first thing you do, different types of scoring. Okay, if it just says 2VP, it's 2VP, nice and simple. If it says something like this, 1 VP per flag, if you can see that, 1 VP per flag. For every card with a flag at the bottom of it, that's in your discard pile, in your hand, in your player area, or in your history, then that will count towards scoring. I'll come on to history when we do the keywords. The other type of points is points with a question mark here, where it's an and or condition, and you will score one way or the other depending on where it is. For example, this one is 7 VP if the card is placed in their player's history, otherwise it's worth 3. Okay, hopefully we are making sense up to this point, but in order for it to fully make sense, we need to look at some of the keywords. And the keywords are a very important part of this game, but there's very, very many of them, so I'm just going to highlight some of the main ones that will appear throughout the game, regardless of what faction you are. The first keyword I will show you will be this one here. Put this card into your history. What does that mean? Well, you play it. Spend the action to resolve the effect. The effect will be whatever the effect is. When you've finished, you take your card and you place it underneath your power card or your faction ID card, and carry on with the rest of the game. The card is now permanently placed underneath your power card, and the cards that are under there are referred to as your history. So your history is underneath your power card. The next keywords I'll look at will be acquire and breakthrough. Now, we sort of touched on breakthrough earlier, and they basically do the same thing, but how they work are slightly different. Okay, so if we're going to acquire, you take the relevant icon. So for example, here we have pay 2 to acquire either a region or a tributary, and so quite simply we take a card and we add it to our hand. If you take a card with unrest, you take them both and add them both to your hand. Although your draw limit is 5 when you redraw, you can go over that when you are playing your turn. Should you take a card that has a token on it, then you take the tokens as well. Breakthrough, it's very, very similar, except you have the option to take from the top row. So, for example, if we were to acquire a region card, we take it from here. If we break through, we can either take that one or the one from the top of the region deck. If you take from here and you have an unrest card, you don't need to take it, you just take the card itself. Now, the more observant of you may have noticed that there is no separate pile for the tributary cards. They're all in this deck. So if you want to break through for a tributary card or one of those flags, you look through the deck and the first tributary card you come across is the card that you take. Then you reshuffle and place back on the top here. It's a subtle difference, acquire and breakthrough, but it's very important because you avoid all those unpleasant unrest cards. Okay, another one you'll come across a lot is garrison. You may garrison a card. What does that mean? Okay, so this is a region. It is a card that has a permanent effect or a long-lasting effect. That's what the ability sign is. So when you play, and for now I'm just going to pretend this is my play area here. Okay, so at the end of my turn I've cleaned up, the card stays. And when it says garrison, what it means is you can take one of the other cards in your hand and place it underneath the card that you've just played. What that does is it keeps cards like cards that are in the wrong era. Like for example, if we were in the Empire era and we had a barbarian card, place the barbarian card underneath, it gets them out of your hand, but keeps them scoreable at the end of the game. So garrison, keep a card underneath a card you've just played that stays in your play area. You cannot reactivate this effect once it's played unless it says exhaust, and we'll come to exhaust now. Looking at exhaust, let's pretend this card is in our play area. It's a long-lasting thing and we've played it. As I'm playing my actions, and I can play other cards to do other things, so I've done that, I've done that, I've only got one token left, but I really want to have this effect on here. it says exhaust. I can place this on the card and then do the ability that says exhaust. So exhaust is playing a card in your player area, again using these tokens. You have a limited number of tokens, and once they're gone, they're gone. You can't play any more exhaust tokens. And don't forget that your nation deck and your development are exhausted when you do your return to full hand redraw of cards when your deck is empty. So exhaust, play a card that's been played before. Another one you'll come across is abandon. Abandon means take one of these cards with a permanent effect out of your play area and return it to your discard. If you have garrisoned a card, you take them both unless an effect says otherwise. So garrison is to play a card and to put a card underneath another card. Abandon is take those cards, put them back into play. See an effect called exile. What that means is you take one of these cards and you place it at the end of the row in the exile area here, and that's now out of the game. If you have any unrest cards underneath, you place them on the unrest pile and then redraw. Placing another unrest card, if applicable, underneath. You cannot exile cards that have tokens on them. So you could exile this one, this one, this one, or this one, but not this one. Okay. If a card says may, you can choose to do that card or that effect. Normally when you play cards, you play as much of the text as possible. So for example, let's pick something. Yeah, here it says choose to either pay 2 to acquire or pay 3 to break through. That is the effect. You do one or the other. Here, with it says may, you may put a card from discard into your history. You don't have to do that, that's optional. But it then says exile a card from the market, so you must exile, and then it says you may garrison. So there are 3 things there. You only have to do exile, but you can do the other 2. That's important to remember as well. That's an option. Something else you may see is something that says free play. I may just have to hunt for it. Yeah, so here we have free play. This is a card you can play anytime during your turn, and it does not cost an action. Those are probably the most common keywords you'll come across. The ones you'll be seeing the most are probably garrison, history, acquire, and breakthrough. Exhaust is quite common, as is exile as well. They're the main ones. There are others, but they're the main ones. What I'll do now is I'll have a quick look at how you set up the solo bot and look at the solo game. Okay, gone through the multiplayer game, the actions for the player, setup and so on. How do you use the solo bot and the solo system? It is an AI based system. Okay, first thing to note, for the player, setup is exactly the same. The actions are exactly the same. The commons deck is exactly the same. You still have the main deck, the uncivilized, civilized, region, fame, unrest, and then the cards available on the market with a progress token. The bot does work differently to the player. First thing you really need to do is place these 5 tokens out. These represent the cards that the bot is going to potentially play on their turn. You would usually place a spare exhaust token here, but I personally place a solstice card there because that helps me remember to do a solstice, and there's going to be some things that are easy to forget at the end of the game, but at the end of the video. No, the bot deck setup is different. The first thing you'll do is you will place the power card down. Then you need to find the development cards, which are the ones with the symbols on the cross symbol in the corner, and you need to sort them in order of their points value, with the most valuable being the asterisks, and they kind of need to be the highest ones need to be at the top. So you'd sort them so that when you turn them face down, the higher value card is at the top. The asterisk is always considered the highest value card. And then your ascension card with the circle will be placed face up on top of the development cards. Once you've sorted the development cards in points value, place the ascension card face up on top. You then take the nation cards with the crescent moon symbol, give them a shuffle and place them face down. This is known as the dynasty deck. As with the player, when you reach this card and this card goes into the bot's play deck, you then flip the state card from Empire to from Barbarian to Empire. The remaining cards you shuffle and place in a draw deck. I'm just going to put them that way so that we know that they're different. Once the bot deck is fully set up, so you have the state, the power card, the dynasty deck and the draw pile, you then take a card and place a card in each of the slots that you're playing with in the game. This number may vary depending on how difficult you want the game to be. 5 is the standard. Less is varying to various types of slightly easier to play. And then you're ready to go. How does the bot take its turn? I've moved all the player cards out of the way so that we can focus on this. Basically, at the end of your turn, once you've done the cleanup and you've drawn back up if you need to, everything's done, the bot takes its turn. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to play these cards. And how you determine which ones you play is you roll a die, and if the die number has a card underneath it, that card is not used in this turn, okay? But then you resolve all the others. And so, for example, we flip the first card and we resolve it in its entirety, okay? How do you resolve it? Well, you basically completely ignore all the text on the cards and instead you look at these tables. The tables themselves are in the rulebook. They're not in these separate cards. I've made these myself. Normally you would have these tables in the rules. But basically what you'll do is you'll go down the table and the first symbol on the table that is also on the card is the action that you will take. So for example, in this case we have Dido, the Queen of Carthage, and when you scroll down we don't have an unrest, we don't have a fame, it's not glory, but it does have the barbarian symbol, and so then you follow the text for the barbarian action and you do what it says, and to the fullest extent possible. You may not be able to do everything, you may not have 3 tokens for population, so you may not be able to break through for the tributary card, but you may be able to spend 2 materials to acquire a civilized or an uncivilized. And you do it to the fullest extent possible. Once you've done it, and you will then place the card into the bot's discard unless the action tells you otherwise, and move on to the next one. And again we have Conquer. Conquer again is a barbarian action, and you just repeat this until you have played all of the cards. Now some cards may not have a symbol, they may simply have a name, and so in which case you follow the name. So for glory you would do what it said for the glory name card. If there is no symbol or text on the column, you simply go to other and do what you can under the other, Okay, if you have multiple symbols, and I'm not sure if we're going to find one from this selection here, if you have multiple symbols, so for example we do have the infinity sign, we have the region sign, and we have a little bag of money or food there, you would do the first one. So here, although we have the infinity symbol and the region, we come to the region first on the table, so it's that action we do, not the infinity one. I hope that makes sense. Now, once you've discarded all the bots cards, you will slide any card that has not been played due to the fact it was on the dice to the end of the row, so it is now the first card in the next turn, and then draw back up to 5 by placing cards from the draw deck into the bot play area. If ever the bot's draw deck is empty, then you draw back up. Same principle as before. You take one of these cards and place it into the discard pile, shuffle, and then refill as needed. Now, if as in this case, there is no space, you don't refill and reshuffle until there is no space here. So, for example, if it looked like this, then you would take a card, shuffle, and place the top card in the pile. Otherwise, you leave it until such time as you need to place a card here. That's the equivalent of taking a card into hand. When the bot has been, have a solstice. You have the solstice, not the bot. So you just, any of those cards with the solstice effect, you do those at that point. And then you move on to your turn, and you move in through the new turn, carrying on again. When it comes to the cleanup, you do also, as the bot, still need to place a progress token onto the cards. And the way it works with the bot is you place it on the slot indicated by the dice. So in this case it would be a 5. So the progress token, or the new progress token, would go where the dice said. Then you take your turn. There are a few changes to some of those keywords. If it was to exile, it will always be the leftmost one, unless there is a token. It can never exile tokens. If it's asked to acquire or break through, if possible, it will always draw the card with the most victory points possible for it. Some factions do place different tokens on the market board. So for example, we do have Carthage here, and this is a good example of a faction that differs from everything else. Here you place 2 of these instead of the progress token based on your faction ability. In terms of scoring, the bot will also score for its progress as in the multiplayer game, and then every 10 of these tokens will also count as a VP, and then you score based on the number of VPs on the card in much the same way as before, except you the asterisk cards like this one here will always score 5. There's less calculation to do for the bot. This board is now set up for a game of Persia versus Carthage. Before I do that though, which will be another video, let's have a think about this game for a moment. It's a complicated game with lots of different effects and lots of different abilities. And that means there are things that it's easy to overlook. And so this little section here is just going to be the things that I personally have found really, really easy to overlook. Okay, first thing, at the end of your turn and at the end of the bot's turn, when you clean up, the first thing you do is put a token onto one of the cards. It's your choice in the multiplayer for your turn, multiplayer and solo. There's instructions on how it works for the solo bot, but place a points token or a token as specified by your faction onto one of the cards as the first thing you do in cleanup. I think I have forgotten that more than anything else. Second thing I frequently forget is the difference between acquire and breakthrough. Acquire, take the cards from this row that's visible, including the unrest card. Breakthrough, it's either the top row or the visible row, but you do not take the unrest card if there is one. The third thing I often forget is when you need to redraw your hand and your discard deck is empty, you do it when you need to refill your hand. That's part A of the third thing that I forget. Part B is that when you place one of your nation deck into your discard before redrawing your hand, you have to put one of these on. And then part C of the things I'm frequently forgetting is that when you clean up and you remove your action tokens, you remove your exhaust tokens, remove this token also. Number 4, not so much something I forgot, but something I didn't realise to start with, is that this development deck is a deck you can look through and choose which card you buy. That is a difference between the nation deck where you just take the top one. Here you get to choose, and that's important because for at least the first couple of games, if not the first 3 games I played, I was working through the deck of cards trying to pay the cost each time, and some of those cards are fantastic and much better than others. With the solo game particularly, don't forget the solstice. This is the opportunity to use those cards you have in front of you with the solstice ability. Don't forget those. It's really easy to forget when you're playing solo because you're only doing the 2, your turn, the bot's turn. Bit easier in multiplayer because it comes around and there's more people to see that it's the solstice. But in the solo game, I found it so easy to forget that I've got solstice cards. And so what I do is I roll the die, I place die on the thing, I resolve the actions, and then after I have slid the card down, I move the die across and so I can see the card. And when the die hits that card, I know it's time to do a solstice. The only other thing I can think of currently that I frequently forget is an example here on my table of where I haven't left enough space. The game does require a little bit of space, and you do need space underneath your area or to the side or somewhere that is your player area. Don't forget that. And one thing that I've just thought of is the difference between abandon and the other ways of acquiring cards or breaking through, as it is. When you abandon, you place the cards into your discard, which will be here, not into your hand. So abandon is when you take these cards that's in your play area, you return them into the game, you place them into your discard, not your hand. When you break through or acquire or take an unrest card, they come into your hand and you can play them. Abandon goes into discard, meaning you can't play them straight away. Okay, I think that is everything that I need to cover for this game. Quite a long video. Thank you for staying this far and for joining me in the first place. this game is now set up for Persia versus Carthage, so I think I'm going to go and play a game and upload that video when it's ready. But in the meantime, thank you for joining. I hope you enjoy this game as much as I do, and I hope this has helped get to grips with the learning curve that you may experience with the game if you're anything like me. All that being said, I will see you next time.